All right, welcome back. So we're now in part 2 in chapter 11, and we're going to talk now about Lewis and Clark and Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. And so coming back from the break, the first slide that we're going to look at is a map, and that map is different from the two maps that we looked at in part 1. Part 1, we looked at kind of the Northwest Territory and how that changed. We looked at Georgia and we looked at Tennessee. Now, on this map, I want you to look at the Louisiana Purchase. And this is the yellow area, the orangish gold color right in the middle of the United States. On the previous maps, this belonged to Spain and to France. But in 1804, Thomas Jefferson, as President of the United States, purchases this land from Napoleon, who was governing France at that time. Napoleon was engaged in wars in other places, and he does not want to bother with North America at this point. And so, so this is really a moment for the United States where we begin to push further west, because Native Americans, we begin to push the Native Americans west, and we didn't treat them very well, unfortunately. But as they move west, Americans also move west into this new territory. But initially, no one knows this territory, this Louisiana Purchase. No one has explored this territory. And so to understand the Louisiana Purchase, let's go back from 1804 to 1803. And I want you to go forward to the next slide that says Jefferson and Congress. Now, in January of 1803, Thomas Jefferson sends a secret letter to Congress, and he says this: "The river Missouri and the Indians inhabiting it are not as well known as is rendered desirable for their connection with the Mississippi." And so he says, we want to learn more about the Indians that are on the Mississippi River and on the Missouri River. "An intelligent officer with 10 or 12 chosen men might explore even to the Western Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, have conferences with the natives, and return in the course of 2 summers." So we can do this in a year to 2 years. Actually, it takes a little bit longer than that. But remember, this letter that Thomas Jefferson is writing is in January of 1803. This is French territory. We don't own this land yet. Thomas Jefferson was sending spies out to explore another country's territory, hoping, of course, that we could acquire the Louisiana Territory. But then in 1804, France does sell this land to the United States. But in between that period, Thomas Jefferson puts together what we now call, and you can go to the next slide, the Corps of Discovery. Now, corps is a Latin word that means, it comes from the Latin word that means body or corpse or corpus. But we say the Corps of Discovery. It's a group of men, a core group of men that are going out into this Louisiana Territory to explore. They're led by Army Captain Meriwether Lewis, and he's 28 years old, and Captain William Clark, who at the time is 32. Now, they do have one woman join the expedition shortly after they begin, and her name is Sacagawea. And they do have one slave, and the slave belongs to Captain William Clark, and his name is York. The rest of the total expedition is about 40 people. They're going into this unknown territory to find the start, the source, the beginning of the Missouri River, but they also want to reach the Pacific Ocean by land. If we can find a water route, a river all the way from St. Louis or from the eastern part of the United States, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, that would save so much time, because at the moment we have to go all the way from, say, New York, all the way down south of the United States, all the way down and under South America, and then come back up the other side, and then there we are in the Pacific. And that's just takes too much time. So if we can find a route that goes across, a river that goes across the continent, that would be so much easier. And that's what Thomas Jefferson wants to do. The budget is not very much today, but it's a lot of money back then. The budget is only $2,500 US. They leave from St. Louis, Missouri, and they leave in May of 1804. Now, I do have a map up here, and I will show you a map in just a minute of where St. Louis is. But so picking this up, we leave from St. Louis in May of 1804, and the entire expedition, they're out there, they don't have a doctor, they're exploring. They only fire their guns one time in anger at the Native Americans, and there's only one man on the expedition that dies. It's a very successful expedition. They discovered lots of new flowers, lots of new plants for science. Of course, the Native Americans always knew that they were there, but Lewis and Clark take them back and introduce them to science. Now, during this same time, so we kind of put this on pause and think about this expedition leaving in May of 1804. I want to look at April of 1804, just 1 month prior to that. Jefferson gets a letter from Abigail Adams. And before I talk about this letter, I want to remember that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, they wrote the Declaration of Independence together. They were founding fathers together. They were in Europe as ambassadors in England and France together. They both served President George Washington in his administration. John Adams was the vice president. Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State. John Adams was the second president, and Thomas Jefferson was his vice president. They ran against each other in 1796. They ran against each other again in 1800. And they don't really like each other at this point. They were good friends in the beginning, and then they became enemies. So in April of 1804, Thomas Jefferson, his daughter, dies. She's 26 years old, and after giving childbirth. And we talked about in the last section that just this was such a dangerous thing to have babies. So Abigail Adams, she's a mother, and she understands how difficult this is. And even though she does not like Thomas Jefferson anymore, is angry with him, she writes him a letter. And this is what the letter says. You can read this with me. The slide is titled Jefferson A. Adams. It says AA to TJ, Abigail Adams to Thomas Jefferson. And this is what she said. Recent events have awakened in my bosom, but reasons of various kinds withheld my pen, meaning I didn't want to write you for various reasons, until the powerful feelings of my heart have burst through the restraint and called upon me to shed the tear of sorrow over the departed remains, meaning I was so sad about your daughter that I had to write you a letter. And she continues in the next quote, it has been some time since I conceited of any event in this life which could call forth feelings of mutual sympathy. But I know how closely entwined around a parent's heart are those cords which bind the filial to the parental bosom. So she's saying, I am a parent. I understand how much you love your daughter and how strongly the connection and the relationship is between the parent and the child. And so I felt like I wanted to write you a letter. So continuing to the next slide that says also Jefferson A. Adams. And she says this, continues, I have tasted the bitter cup, and I bow with reverence and humility before the great dispenser of it, without whose permission overruling providence not a sparrow can fall to the ground. Now, Abigail Adams herself had lost 3 of her 6 children at very young ages. She didn't die from childbirth, but one of them was born already dead. Then one of her children died at 2 years old and another at 30 years old. So life was very difficult, and Abigail Adams understands that, and she's telling Thomas Jefferson, because he doesn't have a wife, his wife dies, who's going to comfort Thomas Jefferson? And she feels so badly for him. And so Thomas Jefferson writes back, and he says this, the friendship which you honored me has been ever valued and fully reciprocated, and although events that have been passing which might be trying to some minds, I never believed yours to be that kind, nor felt that my own was. Now, I want to time out right here, because he's saying thank you. And he's also saying, I think that we've always had some common ground and that we really still are friends. But then he makes a mistake. Now he's talking, she said, I'm sorry that your daughter died. And now he writes back and he wants to talk politics. And so this is what he says, continuing, and this is the bold, the darker words here. The different conclusions that we had drawn from our political reading and reflections were not permitted to lessen mutual esteem, meaning we disagreed politically, but it didn't make us think any differently of each other. Now look at the next slide. This is what she has to say. This letter is written in confidence. No eye but my own hath seen what has passed. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, meaning you were my friend and you hurt me. And those wounds that you gave me are still there. It's still true. I still hurt from the difficulties that we had. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Often I have wished I have seen a different course pursued by you. I hear no malice. I bear no malice. I cherish no enmity. I would not retaliate if I could. Nay, more in the spirit of true Christian charity, I would forgive, as I hope to be forgiven. Now, at the beginning of that, she says, no one has seen this letter. I'm writing this letter to you in secret. But then, the last letter that they send to each other, she shows her husband, John Adams, and this is what he says. The whole of this correspondence was begun and conducted without my knowledge or suspicion. Last evening and this morning, at the desire of Mrs. Adams, I have read the whole. I've read all of them. I have no remarks to make upon it at this time and in this place. Now that's really interesting because you really wonder, why is he writing that? Is he writing this because he knows in 200 years you and me are going to be reading and wondering what this communication was all about? Very interesting development. We're going to come back to that in a later chapter, this relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, very complicated. So we're going to talk more about that later. But what I want you to understand is that that is taking place, this correspondence is taking place at the same time as the Lewis and Clark expedition. So John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are communicating, and Abigail Adams is communicating. Thomas Jefferson is running for president in 1804. The election is in November. John Adams says he doesn't know anything about the correspondence that his wife has been having with Abigail Adams and with Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson's daughter dies. All this is happening in 1804 as Lewis and Clark are sailing up the Missouri River. So now I want you to look to the next slide, and you can see a map. On the far right side of that map, near the bottom, we see St. Louis. In May of 1804, this is kind of the edge of the United States at this point, this St. Louis, and they're right there on that river. So Lewis and Clark, this is where they leave from. They don't leave all the way from New York. They leave from St. Louis, and they're from there, they're headed west into the unknown territory. Now, looking at that map, I want you to look up almost to the middle near the top. It says Fort Mandan, and this is where they stayed in the winter. Now, you can go to the next slide. They arrived at Fort Mandan, to live with the Mandan Indians in October of 1804. So after maybe 6 months or so, and this is the last point that anyone knows on the map. After this, after Mandan, now we're out of the United States. It's now American territory, but we're not actually in a place. It's not like you can pull out Google Maps, or you cannot pull out, Bing navigation or open up on the internet and see a satellite image. No one knows what is west of Mandan. So they've gone 1,600 miles upriver. They're in this village of the Mandan. There's about 4,500 people, and this winter is cold. Some of these temperatures are minus 45 degrees. This is, of course, Fahrenheit, and minus 38 degrees. Very cold. One of the coldest winters, believed to be one of the coldest winters that the United States had experienced. So that was October. The next month, in November, look at the next slide. You see a map of the election of 1804. This is November. Thomas Jefferson wins re-election, and he's running against Thomas Pinckney. And the election's not even close. He wins every state, almost every state. His opponent only wins 14 electoral votes. And so we can see at this point that the country is very confident in Thomas Jefferson. Then in 1805, if we look at, and you're going to watch some video clips from the Lewis and Clark expedition, but thinking about this expedition for a moment, in 1805, throughout the expedition, Meriwether Lewis is keeping a journal, and he's writing this journal. There are periods in this journal where he doesn't write anything because he has, we call it bipolar or manic depression. So he has these periods where he's very depressed, and then where he's very excited, and then he comes back down. He's very depressed for about 6 months, and he's very excited again for 6 months. Ultimately, after the expedition is over, Meriwether Lewis takes two guns, one to his chest and one to his head, and he shoots himself and he kills himself. He was so depressed. And it's a very sad story. But that's after the expedition. During the expedition, he writes in his journal, and we know, looking at the slide that says 1805, that they hunted grizzly bears and that they were really, it took 8 to 12 bullets, or 8 to 12 slugs, as they called them, to shoot a grizzly bear. And Lewis at one point wrote, because his soldiers were really curious about the grizzly bear, it's a huge bear. And he says, I find the curiosity of our men with respect to this animal pretty much satisfied. We don't want to bother with it anymore. And what else would they think about and worry about while they're out on this expedition? Well, if you've ever gone camping, you know what people think about and what they worry about on a camping trip. Bugs, mosquitoes. Lewis says that they are troublesome. And then he says, very troublesome. And then he says, exceedingly troublesome. And then he says, very numerous and troublesome. So the mosquitoes were very, very, very troublesome, according to Meriwether Lewis, that his men were mosquitoes everywhere. Of course, they're on the river most of the time, and so it would be very troublesome to have lots of mosquitoes, very common to have them there. When they got to the Pacific Ocean, or when they got past the Mandan villages on the way to the Pacific Ocean, they found nothing initially but mountains. They found the end of the Missouri River, and they hoped to find the Pacific Ocean at the end. But when they find the end of the Missouri River, there's nothing but more mountains. And so it's very discouraging for Lewis and for Clark and for all of the men and the one woman who were on the expedition. But they push through, they climb the mountains, and they make their way all the way to the Pacific Ocean, to the mouth of the Columbia River, right there in what is now Oregon and Washington State on the West Coast. And they winter there, and then they head back to the United States. And they go back to the United States much more quickly than they arrive to the Columbia River in the Pacific Ocean. Now, when they come back, things have changed. Of course, Thomas Jefferson is being re-elected president. His daughter has also died. But the vice president of the United States, Aaron Burr, who, remember, Jefferson doesn't like, had killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. He'd murdered him in a duel. And so Aaron Burr was thought to be treasonous. He was planning to overthrow the government, and he flees from the United States government. There's actually a court case in which Aaron Burr is accused of treason. And so we're going to stop right there, and we're going to pick it up in the War of 1812 in the next chapter, in chapter 12. So, all right, we'll see you guys in chapter 12. Have a great evening or afternoon. All right, bye-bye.